When recently widowed Lila Carter finds a grizzled cowboy sleeping in her barn, she doesn't expect his rough hands to rebuild the pieces of her broken heart. But as secrets from his past rise like a Texas storm, what he builds for her might cost him everything, including his freedom. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more heart-wrenching love stories that will leave you breathless. The wind howled like a creature in mourning, curling around the corners of the old Carter farmhouse and slipping in through the cracks like it knew where to look. Rain tapped insistently against the window panes, sometimes soft as a sigh, other times hard enough to rattle the glass in its frame. The storm had rolled in fast that evening, pulling a thick shawl of thunderclouds over the Arkansas hills and chasing off the late warmth of October. Inside the house, Lila Carter stood barefoot on the cool wooden kitchen floor, wrapped in her late husband's old flannel shirt, staring absently into the dark outside. The power had flickered out just after dinner, leaving her with only a few candles and the dying glow from the wood stove to keep the shadows at bay. She should have gone to bed. Nothing waited for her in the barn anymore, not since the last of the livestock had been sold off earlier that summer. But something tugged at her, a sensation just below the skin, like the sense of being watched, only quieter, less alarming. She grabbed the heavy flashlight from the counter, slipped her feet into the cracked rubber boots by the door, and stepped out into the wet night. The air was sharp with the scent of rain and loam and damp wood. Her breath fogged in front of her as she crossed the yard. Her boots sank into the mud with each step, the old barn looming larger with every pace, a black silhouette against the pulsing gray sky. When she reached the doors, she hesitated. The flashlight beam flickered against the warped wood, casting shadows between the slats. The storm had flung one of the shutters open on the upper level, and it now slapped repeatedly against the frame like an impatient hand. She reached for the latch, heart thudding louder than it should have. The metal felt cold and slick under her fingers as she lifted it. Inside, the smell hit her first. Not the sour, musty odor of mildew or disuse, but something more human. Sweat, maybe. Faint traces of smoke and leather. Her beams swept across the interior. Dust floated like pale ash in the air. The hayloft above was empty except for a few forgotten tools. Her heart skipped when the light caught something at the back of the barn, something that moved. She stiffened. The light trembled in her hand. Nestled between two stacked hay bales and a rusted old trough was a figure curled beneath a moth-eaten horse blanket, a man. Her first instinct was to shout, to demand an explanation or at least a name, but the words stuck in her throat. The man didn't move. His chest rose and fell in the slow rhythm of deep sleep, and only when she stepped closer did he stir. His head shifted slightly beneath the blanket, revealing the edge of a jaw dark with stubble, a nose that had clearly been broken once or twice, and a mat of unkempt, rain-damp hair. "Who the hell are you?" she whispered, voice shaking. He blinked awake slowly, as if surfacing from a dream. When his eyes opened, they were pale blue and startling in the dim light, like the edge of a glacier breaking through ice. He didn't speak right away, only sat up with a wince and held his hands where she could see them. "I didn't mean no harm," he said finally, his voice rough as gravel. "Just needed to get out of the rain for a spell." "This is my land," she said, and even to her own ears she sounded more tired than angry. "I know," he replied, rubbing at the back of his neck. "I figured I'd be gone before morning. Thought no one used this barn anymore." "I don't," she said, then added, "Not much anyway." They stared at each other for a long moment, the storm rattling the roof above them like a child shaking a tin can full of nails. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days. His jeans were soaked to the knees, boots caked in dried mud, and the cuffs of his coat were fraying. She could see the tremor in his fingers as he tried to fold the blanket with a semblance of dignity. "Look, I can go," he said, getting to his feet. He was tall, lean, but not frail. There was something coiled in the way he moved, like a man used to silence and long stretches of nowhere. "Didn't mean to scare you." "You didn't," she lied. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt the weight of his gaze in a way that made her take a step back. There was something about him that reminded her of winter mornings, cold and still and brimming with something unnamed. "Storm's picking up," she said, glancing toward the door. "You'll freeze out there. I've done it before. Don't mean you should again." She exhaled through her nose and crossed her arms. "One night, you sleep in the hay, stay out of the house, and you leave by morning." He gave a small nod. "Fair enough." She turned to go, then hesitated and turned back. "What's your name?" "Bo," he said. "Bo Callahan." She nodded once and left without another word, the name tumbling around in her thoughts like gravel in a tin bucket. Back inside the house, Lila peeled off the damp shirt and changed into dry clothes, all the while trying not to think about the man asleep in her barn. She climbed into bed and listened to the storm roll across the valley, thunder curling around the hills like something alive. She told herself she had done it out of pity, that it was just one night. That in the morning he'd be gone and life would return to its quiet, empty rhythm. But deep down, where logic gave way to instinct, she already knew something had shifted. Something irreversible. Like a door left open just a crack, and a cold wind slipping in to change the air. Morning broke with a pale wash of silver light bleeding through the mist that still clung to the fields like a half-remembered dream. The storm had passed in the night, leaving everything sodden and gleaming, as if the world itself had been scrubbed raw. Lila stood at the window with her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, steam curling toward her face like a beckoning finger. The scent was earthy and strong, grounding her in the quiet stillness of dawn. She watched the gray sky lighten, the long grass outside bending gently in the breeze, and her eyes drifted inevitably to the old barn. The night before came back to her in fragments. The rain, the stranger, the way his eyes held a history too heavy for words. She should have been uneasy. A woman alone, letting a man she didn't know sleep on her land. And yet, what she felt wasn't fear. It was something quieter, stranger, like the pull of a current beneath still water. She set the mug down and pulled on her boots, not bothering with socks. The wet leather kissed her ankles as she stepped outside. The air smelled of pine and earth, heavy with the scent of last night's rain. She walked slowly, not out of hesitation but out of curiosity. The morning was still but not silent. A blue jay scolded from the fence post, and the distant low of a neighbor's cow broke the hush. As she neared the barn, she noticed something unusual. The sagging gate to the south pasture, which had been hanging by one rusted hinge for the past month, now stood straight. New nails glinted faintly in the early light, and the boards no longer wobbled with every gust of wind. Her brows knitted as she stepped closer. Someone had mended it. Not patched it or jerry-rigged it with wire, but carefully and properly repaired it the way her husband used to. She pushed the barn door open, the wood groaning softly against its swollen frame. The scent inside had shifted. The smell of old hay in musty corners remained, but now there was the unmistakable tang of fresh pine, the bite of clean-cut lumber. Bo was crouched near the far wall, hammer in hand, driving the last nail into a board that sealed a gaping hole near the base of the wall. Sunlight streamed in from the loft window behind him, casting his silhouette in long shadows across the floor. He wore the same threadbare coat from the night before, sleeves pushed up to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with pale scars and sun-darkened skin. His movements were efficient, methodical, the kind that came from years of doing work that had to be done right the first time. She watched him in silence for a few moments, noticing how he paused between each motion, as though listening to the barn itself. "I didn't ask you to fix anything," she said finally, her voice low but not unkind. He didn't startle. He stood and turned to face her, setting the hammer gently on the ground. There was dust in his hair, and a smear of something darker along one cheek, maybe grease or mud. But his eyes were clear and steady. "I figured it was the least I could do," he said. "For the shelter. You were supposed to be gone by sunrise." I know, he glanced toward the repaired gate. But I saw the fence, figured you might want it holding through the winter. Would have kept my promise otherwise. She studied him for a long moment. You a carpenter? His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one. Not officially. Just a man who's done a lot of building when life let me, and a fair amount of fixing when it didn't. Something about the way he said it made her throat tighten. She looked away, toward the patch of land beyond the barn, where weeds had started to take root in the soft earth. The soil there had once been a thriving garden, now surrendered to time and neglect. I should make breakfast, she murmured. You hungry? Bo hesitated, then nodded once. Appreciate that. Back in the kitchen, she cracked the last of the eggs into a cast-iron skillet, watching them sizzle and curl at the edges. She added salt with her fingers, feeling the warmth from the stove begin to fill the room. The smell of cooking oil and browned yolk filled the space like a familiar song. She sliced bread and dropped the pieces into the toaster, more out of habit than hunger. He stood at the threshold of the kitchen, uncertain, not quite entering but not leaving either. You can sit, she said, not looking up. He moved slowly, like a man afraid of breaking something. The chair creaked beneath him as he sat, and he folded his hands on the table like a schoolboy waiting for instruction. Coffee? She asked. Please. She poured him a cup and slid it across the table. He took it in both hands, inhaling deeply before taking a careful sip. She noticed the way his shoulders relaxed, just slightly, as the heat moved through him. They ate in silence at first, the clink of fork against plate the only sound. Outside, the day began to stir. Crows rose from the trees in a raucous black cloud, and the wind picked up just enough to rattle the wind chimes on the porch. I don't know much about you, she said finally, her tone gentle but firm. I imagine you wouldn't. So tell me something. Anything. He wiped his mouth with a napkin, then set it down with a precision that felt deliberate. I was born in Oklahoma, he began. Joined the Army at 19. Spent 10 years doing things I don't much like to remember. When I came back, there wasn't much left for me. Family gone. Town dried up. Drifted for a while. And now? Now I fix what I can, when I can, and I sleep where there's shelter. She chewed a bite of toast slowly, letting his words settle. There was a blunt honesty in him, the kind that didn't make excuses or ask for pity. You always carry a hammer? He smiled, just a flicker. Always. Never know when a wall's going to fall in. She found herself smiling, too, more from surprise than anything else. He had a quiet way about him, not soft, but steady, like a beam hidden inside a wall, holding more weight than anyone realized. When the plates were empty and the coffee nearly gone, she stood and crossed her arms over her chest. Her eyes held his for a long moment. You can stay another night, she said, but the barn only. He nodded. Understood. And tomorrow we'll see. The sun pushed higher behind her, illuminating the faint lines around her eyes, the ones that hadn't been there 2 years ago. She turned away, but not before she caught the smallest shift in his expression. Something unspoken, something like gratitude, laced with something else. Something she hadn't let herself feel in a long, long time. She didn't know what it meant yet. She wasn't ready to name it. But for the first time in months, she didn't feel quite so alone in her own kitchen. And that, perhaps, was reason enough to let the day begin. The sun slid gently across the horizon like honey pouring over the lip of a bowl, warming the farm in long streaks of gold. Morning settled into the valley in a way that felt familiar, almost sacred. Lila stood near the front porch, her fingertips brushing against the peeling paint of the railing, still warm from where the sun had touched it. She sipped her second cup of coffee, the bitter taste grounding her as she watched Bo walk the fence line with a coil of wire slung over his shoulder and a bucket of tools swinging from one hand. There was something rhythmically soothing about his movement. He walked with the slow precision of someone who'd learned to read the land like scripture. His stride was long and deliberate, his head tipped down, his gaze scanning for breaks in the line. He stopped every few paces to tighten a section, replace a staple, or tap something into place with the quiet confidence of a man who didn't need to explain what he was doing to anyone. Lila didn't call out to him, didn't break the stillness. Watching was enough. There was something quietly magnetic about the way he worked, not performative, but purposeful. She hadn't realized how much she missed seeing someone work the land with intention. James had moved like that too, once. With that same kind of gentle authority, as though the land spoke to him in a language she hadn't ever quite learned. The memory rose before she could stop it. James leaning over the side of the tractor, grease on his hands and a grin on his face. James patching holes in the same fence line, waving her over just to steal a kiss that tasted like sun and dust and apple slices. That life had felt endless then, full of shared glances and muddy boots and dinner made together while the sky dimmed outside. She exhaled slowly and turned away. Inside, the kitchen still smelled faintly of eggs and soap. The dishes were already done, the counter wiped clean. She needed something to do with her hands. Her fingers itched for motion, for distraction. She wandered toward the barn instead, curious to see what else the man might have done while she slept. When she pushed the door open, she was met with a strange sensation. The space, once stale and forgotten, felt lived in. There was a tidiness to it that hadn't been there before. The stack of hay had been recentered. Old tools hung neatly from the pegs on the wall. Even the air smelled different. Less like rot and more like fresh-cut wood, and the faint trace of cedar from some nearby lumber. Her eyes caught on something to the right. A few planks of clean pine leaned against the wall beside an open toolbox, the contents arranged so precisely it almost looked like a still life. And there, near the stall that hadn't held a horse in over a year, sat a small stool beside a worn leather-bound notebook, its cover curling slightly at the edges. She picked it up without thinking, fingers brushing over the supple leather. The first few pages were blank. Then sketches began to appear. The lines were fine, deliberate. Blueprints, she realized. Of the barn, and not just the barn as it was now, but as it might be. Walls patched and raised, roof mended, a loft built for storage. And there, in the corner of one page, a small note written in tight script. Red door, just like he wanted it. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the words, the ink pressed just deep enough to leave a faint imprint on the page below. She remembered that detail from a late-night conversation over whiskey and weather forecasts. James had wanted to rebuild the barn with a red door, something cheerful against the green of the hills. He used to say every good barn deserved a little color, like a kiss on the cheek of an old face. She closed the notebook gently and set it back where she'd found it. Her throat ached. Later that afternoon, she found herself near the fence line, carrying a basket of apples picked from the last standing tree in the orchard. The fruit was smaller than she remembered, but sweet. She handed the basket to Beau as he paused in the shade of a cottonwood. "You didn't have to fix the south end," she said quietly. "That section's been giving me trouble for months. James used to patch it with chicken wire and prayers." Beau grinned, just a flash. He took an apple from the basket, turning it over in his hand like it was a gem. His fingers were rough and dirt-streaked, but gentle in the way they cradled the fruit. "Chicken wire's got its place," he said, "but a clean splice holds better." He bit into the apple and closed his eyes briefly, chewing slowly. The sound of cicadas hummed through the tall grass, and the wind carried the dry rustle of leaves ready to fall. Lila sank onto the upturned crate he'd been using as a seat. "Where'd you learn all this?" she asked. He shrugged, wiping his mouth on the back of his hand. "Picked it up here and there, did some work on ranches when I got back, learned quick if I wanted to eat." She watched the lines around his mouth as he spoke. They deepened when he frowned and softened when he looked at her, which wasn't often. He had a way of glancing from the side, like too much direct contact might burn. "You're good with your hands," she said. It wasn't flirtation, just truth. She saw him register the compliment and turn it over like a coin in his mind. I try to leave things better than I found them. Something in the way he said it made her heart pinch. A goat bleated from the corner of the field, loud and disgruntled, its front hoof caught in the wire. Lila stood quickly, but Bo was already moving. He crouched beside the animal, murmuring low nonsense as he worked the hoof free. The goat butted his shoulder as it bolted off, and he laughed, a real sound that surprised her. "You okay?" she asked as he straightened. "Goat's got a grudge," he said, rubbing his arm. "But yeah." They stood there for a moment, sun sinking lower, the golden hour catching in his hair, lighting the dust on his shoulders like the glow of some old saint in a chapel mural. He looked younger in that light, less burdened. Lila reached for the empty basket and turned to head back toward the house. She didn't invite him in, not yet, but when she glanced over her shoulder and saw him watching her with a look that held more quiet reverence than heat, something inside her shifted. She didn't have a name for it yet, but it fluttered in her chest like wings against a window pane, aching to be let in. The rain came slow that night, not like the storm from days before, but gentle and steady, like a lullaby whispered across the fields. It tapped against the kitchen window as Lila dried her hands on a dish towel and looked out into the dark. A low mist had crept in from the east, swallowing the edges of the pasture, softening the hard lines of fences and trees. The world looked like it had exhaled. The dishes were done. The stove had gone cold, and still she felt restless, that twitch behind her ribs that meant something was shifting. Bo hadn't come in for dinner. Not that she had invited him exactly, but she'd made enough stew for two. The leftovers now sat cooling on the back burner, untouched, waiting in silence. She slipped on her jacket, not bothering to button it, and stepped onto the porch. The air was damp and rich with the scent of wet hay and wood smoke. She followed the path she'd worn without thinking, boots squelching in the soft earth as she moved toward the barn. The sky above was a velvet quilt of navy and silver, stars blurred behind the drifting fog. The barn doors were slightly ajar, and warm light spilled through the crack, flickering like candlelight. Her heart stuttered a little, not out of fear, something else, something quieter. Inside, Bo was sitting on the low stool near the far stall, a battered lantern on the floor beside him, casting golden shadows up the wooden beams. He was whittling a piece of wood, his hands moving slowly, rhythmically, the blade catching the light with each pass. The smell of cedar curled in the air. She could see the outline of what he was, shaping some kind of figure, maybe an animal butt. He paused when he heard her footsteps and looked up. "You didn't come in," she said softly. He nodded toward the lantern. Felt like thinking, "This barn's got a kind of quiet I like." "I made stew." He looked down at the wood in his hands, then back up at her. "I figured it wasn't my place." Something in his voice made her chest tighten. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The barn felt warmer than it should have, not from the lantern, but from the way it held the memory of breath and work and care. "You're always working," she said, "even when no one asks you to." He set the wood down beside him and leaned back against the stall. "Idle hands make for restless thoughts." "Is that what you're running from?" Bo looked at her then, really looked, and in that stillness she felt the weight of something press between them. Not just silence, history. "I served with James," he said, the words soft but sharp. "Overseas, same unit." The breath went out of her in a rush. "I didn't know him long," he continued, voice steady. 6 months, give or take, but long enough to know he was one of the good ones. Too good sometimes. Wouldn't shut up about this place. Said it was small but honest. Said you made the best blackberry jam this side of the Mississippi. Her knees gave a little, and she sat on a hay bale across from him. The lantern's glow softened the lines on her face, caught in her hair like strands of gold thread. "He wrote to me every week," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Even when he couldn't say much. I didn't know he'd ever mentioned me to anyone." Bo nodded. "He talked about you like you were the reason the sun came up in the morning." She looked down at her hands, remembering how his letters had smelled faintly of diesel and dust, how he'd drawn tiny pictures in the margins just to make her smile. "He saved my life," Bo said, the words dropping into the space between them like stones into still water. "It was an ambush. We were pinned. He got me out, took a hit doing it. I never saw him after that." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of all the things they weren't saying. Lila's eyes stung, and she blinked quickly, refusing to let the tears fall. "Why didn't you tell me when you first got here?" "I didn't know if I should," he admitted. "Didn't know if it would help or hurt. I wasn't sure I belonged here." "You think I do?" she asked, the bitterness surprising even her. "I keep this place alive out of guilt and habit. Every wall reminds me of him, every field, every sound." He didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer anything but presence, which was somehow more valuable. "I thought I'd come back and pick up where we left off," she said. "But he was the one who knew how to fix things. I plant, I weed, I feed the animals, and I try not to drown in the silence." Bo leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "You're doing more than that. You've kept this place breathing. That takes guts most people don't have." She swallowed hard. "I'm so tired, Bo." "I know." He said it with such certainty, such calm, that her eyes welled again. She bit the inside of her cheek and turned her face toward the wall, but not before he saw. She felt the warmth of his body before she registered the movement. He didn't touch her, not quite, but sat beside her on the hay bale, his shoulder brushing hers. The contact was feather-light but grounding. They sat like that for a long time. The rain whispered on the roof. The lantern flickered and hissed. Somewhere outside, a coyote yipped and fell silent. "I'm not looking for anything," she said finally. "I don't know if I even can anymore." "I'm not asking," he said. "I'm just here." That, somehow, was the most generous thing anyone had said to her in years. Eventually, she stood and moved to the door. Her hand rested on the edge a moment longer than necessary. She turned back to him. "You're welcome to come in for breakfast tomorrow, not just coffee." He nodded slowly. "Thank you." The words settled between them like a promise, not of something grand, not of anything fixed or figured out, just a shared truth in the dark. She stepped out into the night, the mist wrapping around her like a shawl. Behind her, the barn glowed soft with lamplight, and for the first time in a very long while, the silence didn't feel quite so empty. The evening of the fall festival arrived, dressed in shades of amber and gold, the air crisp enough to coax long sleeves and scarves out of closets, but gentle enough to carry the scent of cinnamon and wood smoke without the bite of winter. The sun had begun its slow descent over the hills, bleeding warmth into the sky, casting the fields in a honey-colored light that made the world look like it was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Lila stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, smoothing her hands down the sides of a faded blue cotton dress she hadn't worn since before James deployed. The fabric still clung to her curves in a way that made her feel like herself again, or at least like a memory of herself. Her hair had been twisted back in a loose braid, strands already slipping free to frame her face. She wore no makeup, just a touch of balm on her lips and the scent of rosemary soap still lingering on her skin. She almost didn't go. Every part of her had argued to stay home, to find comfort in the barn's quiet or the soft drone of the radio in the kitchen. But Bo had asked her that morning, his voice low and cautious as he adjusted the gate hinge with his calloused fingers. She hadn't said yes, not outright, but she hadn't said no either. Now, as she stepped out into the cooling air and caught sight of him near the truck, waiting, something pulled at her chest in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. He wore a crisp white shirt beneath a worn canvas jacket, the top button undone, sleeves rolled just once at the wrist. His dark jeans were clean and fitted, his boots polished just enough to show he'd tried. He looked up as she approached, and his expression softened, not with surprise or desire, but with a quiet reverence, like she was something he hadn't known he missed until he saw it again. "You clean up decent," she said, the corner of her mouth tilting upward. "So do you," he replied. "Blue suits you." She opened the passenger door and climbed in, her breath catching slightly when her thigh brushed his hand as he helped her in. His touch was warm, steady, and gone too quickly. The drive into town was quiet, but not uncomfortable. They passed familiar landmarks made strange by twilight, the sagging windmill beside the Johnsons' barn, the willow tree that had been struck by lightning last summer, now regrowing with surprising stubbornness. Lila watched the landscape roll by, feeling time loosen its grip for a little while. When they pulled up to the town square, she could already hear the twang of live music and the laughter of children. The smell of kettle corn, roasted peanuts, and hot cider drifted through the air like a promise. Strings of lights zigzagged between lampposts and storefronts, casting a warm glow that made everything shimmer just a little. Couples strolled hand in hand, teenagers huddled in clusters around food stands, and old men played checkers at a folding table beside the church steps. She hadn't been here since the last festival she attended with James. That memory pressed close to her skin now. He had spun her around on the makeshift dance floor until her feet ached, stealing kisses behind the cider booth like a teenager. She swallowed hard, pushing the image gently away, letting it dissolve in the lights and laughter. Beau kept close, but never hovered. He moved beside her like a man who understood the art of being present without taking up too much space. They browsed the booths together, shared a paper cone of sweet candied pecans, and paused to watch a boy launch himself into a hay bale pile, limbs flailing like a windmill. At one point, an older woman with silver curls and eyes like needles approached. Lila recognized her as Mrs. Renner, the town gossip. She wore a peacoat 2 sizes too small and a smirk that never quite faded. "Lila Carter," she said, her voice sweet and sharp. "I thought you'd gone invisible on us." "Just busy," Lila replied, forcing a smile. "And who's this handsome man?" the woman asked, already looking Beau up and down. Beau tipped his hat politely, voice mild. "Just helping out around the Carter place." Mrs. Renner sniffed, clearly unsatisfied with the lack of drama, but she moved along after a few more pointed glances. Lila turned to Beau, brows raised. "Careful, that one can ruin a reputation faster than a barn fire." He chuckled. "Guess I better keep my distance then." She looked up at him, her breath catching again, but this time from something softer. "I don't want you to." The words surprised her, but she didn't take them back. Beau looked down at her, his expression unreadable, and then nodded, just once. As the music picked up and couples began to gather on the worn wooden platform in the center of the square, Lila stepped back. She had danced here too many times with James, their laughter echoing beneath the lights, his hand always firm at the small of her back. It felt like a line she shouldn't cross. Beau turned to her gently. "We don't have to. We can just watch." But the music changed. The notes dipped into something slow, something thick with longing. A waltz, drawn out and delicate. She felt it in her chest before she even moved. Her feet led her forward before her mind caught up. "I want to," she said. He held out his hand, palm open and waiting. She took it. His hand was warm and strong, fingers wrapping around hers like they belonged there. They moved slowly at first, unsure, but the rhythm found them. The world around them dulled, the noise and color bleeding away until all that remained was the sound of fiddle strings and the steady pressure of his hand on her back. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Their bodies moved together with the cautious familiarity of two people learning a new language with old words. He smelled of cedar and soap, and when she closed her eyes, she felt the roughness of his palm against her shoulder blade, the steady beat of his heart beneath her hand. When the song ended, they didn't move for a moment, just stood there, breath mingling in the cool air, eyes locked in that space where something unnamed began to take root. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of something that might grow if given light and time. Bo stepped back first, releasing her slowly, like she was something fragile. "Thank you," he said, voice low. "For what?" she asked, though she already knew. "For letting me be a part of this." She smiled. It was small, but it reached her eyes. "Come on," she said. "They've got cider. It's the least I can do." As they walked side by side through the glowing square, she reached for his hand without thinking, and when his fingers curled around hers, warm and certain, she didn't pull away. The barn smelled of sawdust and fresh-cut wood, the air sharp with the tang of pine and something warmer underneath, like sweat and old leather. Morning sun streamed through the high window, catching on dust motes that danced in the beams of light like flecks of gold. Lila stood in the center of the space, her boots still wet from dew, watching Bo lift a heavy beam into place with the kind of quiet strength that made her breath catch. He worked without noise, without fuss, his muscles moving beneath his shirt in smooth, practiced motions. The light caught on the curve of his jaw, on the damp strands of hair that clung to his forehead. A pencil was tucked behind his ear, and his hands were stained with dirt and resin and sweat. He looked like something out of a dream, or perhaps a memory. Like the men her grandmother used to talk about, who could build homes with their bare hands and carry their heartbreak like a second coat. The barn had begun to transform. She had been watching it in pieces, day after day, noticing each change like a note in a song she didn't realize she knew. A support beam here, new floorboards there. The loft that once sagged now stood firm, strengthened by new planks, smoothed and sanded. The walls, once patched with rusted tin and hope, had begun to straighten again. But it was more than repairs. There was something intentional about every board he placed, something almost reverent. She stepped closer, brushing her fingers over a section of new wood still rough with splinters. It smelled like the forest after a storm. "Where did you get the lumber?" she asked, her voice soft so as not to break the spell of morning. Bo turned toward her, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. His eyes were calm, blue as a late summer sky after the clouds have passed. Traded with the mill out past Elmore. Gave them some labor and hauled it back myself. "You didn't ask," she said, though there was no accusation in it, only a question hiding in the quiet. "I figured if I asked, you might say no." She tilted her head. "And what if I had?" He shrugged, the barest motion. "Then I would have stopped." "But you didn't." "No," he said, his voice low. "I didn't." She moved closer, her boots creaking against the wood. Her hand brushed the edge of a large sheet of parchment, spread out on an overturned crate. Lines and measurements, angles and elevations. The sketches were more than blueprints. They were visions. And at the center of it all, a doorway outlined in red ink. "You remembered," she whispered, staring at the little note in the corner. "Paint it red, like he wanted." "I didn't forget," Bo said. "He told me about it once when we were stuck on base. Said he wanted to rebuild the barn with a red door. Said it would make you smile." She ran a hand down her braid, a habit she hadn't outgrown since girlhood. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she couldn't find her voice. She turned away, trying to blink the sting from her eyes. "Lila," he said, and his voice was like gravel softened by rain. She looked back at him, and when she did, she saw it. Not just the barn, not just the sketches, but the weight behind his eyes, a tenderness she hadn't dared hope for. Something deep and silent, and carved from the same grief she carried in her chest. He stepped toward her slowly, his movements careful, as though approaching a wild thing he didn't want to scare. His hand reached up, fingers brushing a stray wisp of hair from her cheek. The touch was feather light, but it sent a current through her that she felt all the way to her ribs. "I've been thinking about that night in the barn," he said, "about the way you looked at me, about what it meant and what it didn't." She opened her mouth to speak, but he kept going, his voice low and rough with truth. "I'm not trying to take his place. I couldn't. But I know what it means to lose something you thought would never leave you. I know what it feels like to walk through the world carrying that weight. I see it in you. I see it every day." The words hit her with the weight of something undeniable. She reached up, her fingers resting against his chest, just over his heart. The beat there was steady, quiet, the kind of rhythm that promised patience. "I don't know what I'm ready for," she said. "I don't know if I'm ready for anything." He leaned in, slow as a tide rolling in over warm sand, his breath brushing against her lips. "Then let me wait with you," he whispered. She closed the space between them. The kiss was slow and aching, a question wrapped in heat. His mouth tasted of cedar and sweat and something deeper, something that reached past the present and touched the edge of something sacred. She felt the tremble in his fingers as he cupped her face, the way he held her like she might fall apart in his hands. And she let herself lean into it, into him, into the quiet promise of his touch. When they pulled apart, their foreheads touched, breaths mingling in the space between them. She didn't speak. Neither did he. There was no need. Everything they might have said had already passed between them in the stillness. And then a sound broke the spell. The low growl of tires crunching gravel outside. A door slammed. Then heavy footsteps crossing the yard with purpose. Lila stepped back, instinctively smoothing her dress. Bo turned toward the sound, his body tense. A moment later, the barn doors swung open, the light from outside pouring in around the figure standing in the frame. Sheriff Roy Maddox. His uniform was clean and pressed, his expression unreadable behind the dark lenses of his sunglasses. His presence filled the barn like smoke. "Lila," he said with a curt nod. Then his eyes shifted to Bo. "We need to talk." Lila felt her stomach tighten, felt the sudden shift in Bo's posture, the way his hands curled slightly at his sides. She stepped forward, placing herself between them without thinking. "What's this about?" she asked, voice sharper than it had been in months. Roy looked past her, jaw tight. "You know who he is?" "I know enough." "Then you know he's wanted in connection with a fight down in Missouri. A man put in the hospital. Witnesses say Bo Callahan was involved." Lila's mouth went dry. She turned to Bo. His face was stone, but his eyes flickered. "I didn't start it," he said quietly, "but I was there." Roy stepped forward. "You need to come with me." Bo nodded slowly. "All right." "No." Lila's voice cracked like a whip. Bo looked at her then, really looked, and she saw it again, that same patience, that same quiet promise. "It's okay," he said. "Let me take care of this." Then he turned and followed Roy into the morning light, his shadow stretching long behind him across the barn floor. Lila stood frozen, the red door and the sketch behind her, bright and unreal. And all around her, the barn waited in silence. The scent of sawdust still hung in the air, and the wood he had cut with his own hands still stood, strong, steady, waiting. The sky was the color of raw wool, thick with clouds that seemed to press down against the hills like a hand too heavy to lift. The fields lay quiet beneath the weight of it, and the wind had gone still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Lila stood on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the sheriff's truck disappear down the road until the dust stopped rising and even the memory of its engine faded into silence. The taste of copper clung to the back of her tongue, metallic and sour. Her palms still tingled from where she had pressed them together too tightly, her breath shallow, her heartbeat dragging like a broken wheel. She had watched Bo climb into that truck without a fight. No pleading, no protest, just a quiet resignation, like a man who had long since stopped expecting the world to deal him mercy. She wanted to scream, not out of anger, not even fear, but the sheer helplessness of it, the raw ache of watching someone walk away when every part of her screamed to hold on. Inside, The house felt hollow. Every room seemed too large, too still, like it had gone into mourning the moment he left. She wandered aimlessly, touching things without thinking. The worn back of a kitchen chair, the handle of the stove, the edge of the sink, where the sponge still held the faint scent of the lavender soap she had used that morning. It all felt borrowed now, temporary, like a life she had stepped into by mistake. She walked back out to the barn. The wood groaned as she opened the doors, the scent of sawdust rising up to greet her like a ghost. The tools Bo had arranged so meticulously still hung in perfect rows. The sketches remained on the crate, anchored by a smooth river stone. She picked them up slowly, her fingers brushing over the lines he had drawn. The red door, outlined so carefully. A vision not for himself, but for her. She sank onto the stool, her knees giving in beneath the weight of the day. The silence pressed in, thick and warm. She could still see his hands, rough and steady, moving through the space with quiet purpose. She remembered how he had looked at her the night before, the way his fingers had brushed her cheek like she was something precious. And now he was gone. Roy had given her nothing, just a clipped explanation and a handful of names. Missouri, a bar, a fight that ended badly, witnesses, Bo's name, his silence. The list felt like a page torn from someone else's story, not the man she had known, the man who had rebuilt her gate before he'd asked for a second cup of coffee, who had drawn James's dream from memory and made it real. She stood abruptly, her breath ragged. She needed answers, not assumptions, not rumors, and she knew exactly where to start. By late afternoon, she was behind the wheel of her truck, the engine rattling beneath her as the road unwound like a ribbon of dirt through the trees. She drove without music, windows down, the wind tangling her braid and drying the salt from her cheeks. The sheriff's station sat at the edge of town like a forgotten relic, squat and square, the flag out front snapping in the breeze. Roy was seated at his desk, sipping from a foam cup, eyes already wary the moment she stepped through the door. "I'm not here for pleasantries," she said. He set the cup down and leaned back in his chair. "I figured. Tell me everything. No vague statements, no clipped answers." He sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "There was a bar fight down near Springfield. 3 men. One ended up in the hospital with a fractured jaw and 2 broken ribs. Bo was ID'd as one of the participants. Went off the grid after that." "Did he hit the man?" she asked. Roy shrugged. "No one's saying for sure. The stories vary. The man who was hurt has a record. Not clean. There's talk it started with a racial slur. Some folks say Bo was trying to pull someone else out of the mess. Others say he landed the punch that ended it. Either way, he vanished." Lila crossed her arms, grounding herself. "That doesn't sound like guilt. That sounds like a man who's been through enough to know he'd never get the benefit of the doubt." Roy's eyes softened just slightly. "Maybe. But you have to understand, I'm the law here. When someone shows up in my town with a red flag hanging over them, I can't ignore it, even if he's cleaned up your barn and kissed you under a fall moon." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "He deserves better than this." Roy looked at her for a long moment. "You know he served with James, right?" "Yes." "He never talked about it, not even when he came back. Just drifted through, helped out where he could. I saw him once, right after he returned. Looked like a man pulled from wreckage. Eyes like ice, but burned underneath." "He's not broken," Lila said, her voice firm. "I didn't say he was," Roy replied. "But he's carrying something, maybe more than you know." She left the station without another word, the weight of Roy's final sentence trailing behind her like smoke. Back at home, dusk had begun to settle. The barn stood quiet, shadows stretching long across the grass. She went back inside, poured a glass of whiskey, and stood at the window staring out across the darkening fields. The glass was warm in her hand, but it did little to numb the ache beneath her skin. On the kitchen table lay the box she had found tucked beneath the blankets in the barn that morning. She hadn't dared open it before, not when Bo was still here. But now, with nothing left to lose, her hands found the latch. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some unopened, some worn thin from repeated reading. Most were addressed to no one. A few bore James's name. She lifted one out and unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was rough but steady, the ink smudged in places. The words hit her like rain on a dry roof. You saved me. You pulled me from the fire, and I walked away knowing I didn't deserve it. I've tried to build something since then, even if it's only fences and barns. I just want to leave something better than what I found. Tears spilled onto her cheeks, hot and quiet. Another letter. If I ever meet her, I'll tell her what you were, what you meant. Maybe I'll even tell her that I remember the red door. She pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. Bo had not run from guilt. He had run from the weight of being misjudged again and again. He had lived in the cracks between towns, the silence between conversations, and all the while he had carried James with him like a second shadow, and when he found her, he had not asked for anything. He had only given. The barn stood outside, waiting, and so did she. The morning after she opened Bo's letters, the world looked different, not brighter, not softer, but more awake somehow, as though the trees themselves had leaned in closer to hear her breath. The air was cold enough to fog the window glass, and she traced the edge of her mug with one finger while steam curled upward from the coffee like something sacred. The words she had read still swam behind her eyes, phrases she could not shake loose, lines written in quiet desperation, in hope, in guilt too large to name aloud. She had not slept. Her hands still smelled faintly of cedar from the box, and her fingers bore faint paper cuts from where she had devoured letter after letter in the dark. There had been dozens, perhaps more, folded into neat stacks tied with twine and ribbon, and even a shoelace. Some had been written in places Bo never named, but she recognized the war in them, the pain, the dislocation of soul that did not come from geography but from survival. It was one letter in particular that stayed with her. A torn scrap written in pencil, the edges uneven, the handwriting urgent. If she ever asks why I built it, tell her it wasn't just a barn. It was a prayer, a promise, a way to put wood and nails where I couldn't put words. I just wanted her to feel something other than absence. Lila closed her eyes and held those words like a secret pressed between her ribs. Outside, the frost sparkled across the pastures like powdered sugar, clinging to fence posts and blades of grass, each one made delicate by the cold. She pulled on her jacket, her scarf, her gloves, and stepped into the air that bit at her cheeks and made her breath puff white. The barn loomed ahead, sturdy and still unfinished, its new boards pale against the old gray ones, a patchwork of time and effort and love, whether Bo had meant it that way or not. She stepped inside and stood for a moment, letting the scent wrap around her. Fresh wood, old hay, oil and pine, and the faintest trace of the soap he used to wash up at the pump. It was all still here. She picked up the hammer he had left behind, turned it in her hands. The worn grip fit her palm perfectly, warm from the sun coming through the window. She spent the morning putting things in order. Not tidying exactly, but setting the space right. Folding the blanket he had slept under, restacking the boards he had cut, touching the red pencil outline he had drawn around the future doorframe, as if just by running her finger along its edge she could bring him back. By noon, she knew what she had to do. She drove into town, stopping only once to pick up the envelope she had tucked inside her glove box. A copy of one of the letters. Not all of them. Just the one that mattered most. The one that proved Bo had not run from violence, but from a life that had never made room for his grief. She walked into the sheriff's office with mud on her boots and fire in her spine. Roy looked up from his desk, surprise flickering in his eyes when he saw her. "I want to testify," she said, "and I want to speak to whoever's handling the case in Missouri. He's not who they think he is." Roy opened his mouth, then closed it. He motioned for her to sit, and she did, the letter already in her hand. "This is from the box he left behind," she said. "It's not a confession. It's not evidence of guilt. It's a man trying to be better than the worst thing that ever happened to him. And it's proof that he didn't disappear out of cowardice. He disappeared because people only ever saw what they were afraid of, not what was hurting." Roy read the letter slowly. When he finished, he exhaled through his nose and set it down with a heavy kind of reverence. "He's in holding," he said. "Hasn't said much. Told them he was willing to go to trial if it came to it." "He shouldn't have to," she said. "Not alone." "I'll make the call," Roy said after a pause. "But you should know, it's not just about what happened in that bar. It's about what people think they saw, and that's harder to fix." "Then we start with what we know," she replied. She left the office feeling like she had cracked something open inside herself. Not anger, not sorrow, just a sense of direction, a shape to her grief, a way forward. She returned to the farm that evening, the light slipping behind the hills like a coin disappearing into deep water. The barn looked different now, not just because of the work Bo had done, but because of the truth that now lived inside its walls. She stepped into the loft where she hadn't dared climb in over a year. The boards were strong beneath her feet. She sat at the edge and looked out through the open hayloft door, where the sky was painted in orange and violet, streaked with clouds like brushstrokes. She remembered James here. She remembered his laughter, his hands sliding across her hips as they danced to music only they could hear. But she did not cry this time. Instead, she smiled softly, the memory no longer a wound but a thread woven into the fabric of something larger. Beneath her, the wind stirred through the slats, the trees whispered, and in the golden light she saw what Bo had built, not as a replacement, but as a reflection, a mirror held up to everything that had been lost and all that might still be found. Tomorrow she would go to court if that's what it took. She would read Bo's words aloud if no one else would. She would tell them that the man they saw was not the man they knew. But tonight, she simply sat, legs dangling from the loft, the cool wood beneath her, the stars beginning to blink open one by one. She tilted her head back, breathed in deep, and let herself believe, just for a moment, that some stories were not over even when the pages stopped turning. The barn stood behind her, unfinished and waiting. The sky stretched above, vast and full of promise. And in the silence, she could almost hear his voice, not James's, but Bo's, steady and low, saying nothing and everything at once. The courthouse in Springfield sat square and heavy on a corner shaded by dying oaks, their leaves dropping in papery spirals that gathered in slow drifts along the sidewalk. The morning was gray, the kind of colorless sky that dulled the edges of everything beneath it. Lila stepped out of the truck and stood still for a moment, one hand resting on the open door, the other pressed flat against the warmth of her coat, where her heart beat like a trapped bird. The air tasted like rain. It had not yet fallen, but the clouds were swollen with the promise of it, and the wind carried a damp chill that crept into her sleeves. She looked up at the building. It was nothing granite-domed roof or marble columns, just brick and limestone with windows that stared out blankly, indifferent to the lives moving in and out beneath them. Inside, the hallways were hushed, the kind of quiet particular to buildings where judgment lives. She followed the signs to courtroom 3, the hem of her dress brushing the backs of her calves with each step. She had braided her hair that morning, not out of vanity, but out of habit, the way her mother once did when she wanted to feel composed. She had worn James's belt buckle, polished until it gleamed like a coin, and tucked one of Bo's letters into her bag, folded tightly as if paper alone might keep her steady. When she walked into the courtroom, her eyes found him immediately. Bo sat near the front, hands resting in his lap, jaw set. His clothes were clean but creased, his boots dull with use, and his posture tense like a man braced against wind. He turned his head slightly at her entrance, and their eyes met. Something flickered there, relief, disbelief, maybe even guilt, but it was fleeting. He looked away again, as if afraid of what he might see written in her face. Lila sat in the gallery, heart thudding hard in her chest as the judge entered, and the trial began. It wasn't a full trial, not yet. It was a hearing, a place for facts and impressions, a place for decisions about what would come next. The prosecutor spoke first, laying out the accusations with the crisp detachment of someone who had said these words 1,000 times before. A fight in a bar, one man badly hurt. 3 witnesses, none of them willing to say clearly who had done what. Beau's name floated through the air like smoke. Then came the defense. Beau's lawyer, a tired-looking man with a crooked tie and a voice like sandpaper, stood and tried to clear the haze. He spoke of military service, of honorable discharge, of Beau's quiet life since. He mentioned temporary jobs and long stretches on the road. He offered context, but not absolution. When he said the words, "We'd like to call Lila Carter to the stand," a hush moved through the room like a wind across wheat. She stood slowly, smoothing her dress as she approached. Each step echoed, and she imagined it was her heartbeat bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. When she sat, the chair was colder than she expected. The oath tasted strange in her mouth. Truth always did when spoken aloud. The defense asked first how she met him, what she knew of him. She told them about the barn, about the way he fixed things without being asked, about the way he worked like a man trying to make up for time lost. She described the sketches, the red door, the care in every nail. Then she pulled the letter from her bag. "I found this after he was taken in," she said, her voice steady but soft. "He didn't leave it for me. Not really. He left it behind because he thought he wouldn't get to explain." The judge nodded, allowing her to read. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper, the creases worn white. "If she ever asks why I built it, tell her it wasn't just a barn," she read aloud. "It was a prayer, a promise, a way to put wood and nails where I couldn't put words." Her throat closed around the last line, but she forced herself to finish. "I just wanted her to feel something other than absence." The silence afterward stretched long and full. Even the judge's pen paused in its scribbling. She looked out across the room, eyes brushing past strangers and landing once again on Beau. He was staring at her like he'd forgotten how to breathe. The prosecutor asked no questions, just shook his head once and sat back. When she stepped down from the stand, she didn't return to the gallery. She walked quietly out the side door and into the narrow hallway that smelled of old books and coffee that had gone cold. She leaned against the wall, pressing her forehead to the cool plaster, her breath catching against the knot rising in her chest. She had done what she could. Now it was out of her hands. An hour passed, then 2. At last the doors opened again. Voices spilled into the corridor, sharp and loud. Footsteps, then Beau. He stopped when he saw her, still framed in the door's edge, the courthouse light casting his silhouette long and dark across the tile. "They dropped the charges," he said, his voice rough. "Insufficient evidence. And I think your words helped more than they'll admit." Relief washed over her so quickly she nearly staggered. She took one step forward, then another, and then she was in front of him. She studied his face, searching for cracks, for hesitation, for anything that might make her doubt the trust she had placed in him. But all she saw was the same quiet man who had waited in the shadows of her grief and built something there without asking for anything in return. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "I didn't know I would," she replied. "But I read your letters, and then I knew I had to." They stood there for a long moment, the noise of the courthouse fading around them. "I don't know what happens now," he said. "I don't have much." Lila reached out, her fingers brushing his hand, then curling around it. "You built something," she said. That's more than most people do in a lifetime." He didn't answer, but she felt the shift in his fingers as they tightened around hers. Warm and real, certain. Outside, the sky was breaking open, the first drops of rain falling in soft rhythms against the stone steps, but Lila did not move. Not yet. This, she realized, was not the end of a chapter. It was the door finally opening, and the steps beyond were theirs to take together. The morning sky unfolded in streaks of rose and pale gold, the kind of light that comes only once the longest shadows have passed. The hills beyond Lila's land were still draped in fog, their edges softened by the night's damp breath, and the Barnhis barn now, hers too, stood in the cradle of that light like something returned from a dream. It looked taller than it had before, straighter, alive in a way old things sometimes become when someone loves them enough to see their worth. Lila stood at the edge of her property, boots rooted in the dew-wet grass, hands stuffed deep in her coat pockets. The tips of her fingers were cold, but her chest was warm, pulsing with a strange, restless heat she had not felt since James was alive. It was not grief. Not anymore. It was something quieter, more certain, the ache of something blooming after a long frost. The last time she had seen Beau was 3 months ago, just after the hearing. He had stepped into the truck without asking for a ride and told her he needed space to breathe, to sort through the weight he still carried. She had not asked him to stay. She had not asked him anything. She had simply touched his hand and told him the barn would be waiting. And now it was. Finished. Whole. She had not heard him return in the night, but she had woken to the sound of tools clinking softly through her open bedroom window just before dawn. Not the harsh clang of construction, but the gentle sounds of something nearing completion. She rose without dressing fully, pulled on a sweater over her nightclothes, and followed the light that flickered beyond the tree line like a promise. Now, as she approached, the scent of paint and sawdust and clean morning air wrapped around her. And there he was, standing just outside the barn door, paintbrush in hand, his shoulders broad beneath a denim shirt rolled at the sleeves. His hair was longer now, curling slightly at the edges, and a soft line of stubble traced the angle of his jaw. He looked both older and younger than she remembered, and when he turned to see her, something bright and wordless lit in his eyes. She stopped a few feet away, hands still in her coat, heart climbing steadily up her throat. "You came back," she said. He nodded, eyes not leaving hers. "I had to. It wasn't done." Her gaze dropped to the door behind him. It was painted red, the exact shade James had once described as cheerful as a cardinal's wing. The paint was still tacky, catching the light like wet velvet. She reached out, rushed her fingertips across it, then looked back at him. "You remembered," she whispered. "I didn't forget," he said, voice low. "Even when I tried to." He stepped aside and opened the door for her. The hinges creaked gently, a sound she knew would fade with time and oil. Inside, the barn was transformed. The hayloft stood clean and solid, lined with shelves that held neatly stacked tools and freshly folded blankets. A workbench stood beneath the far window, beside a small pot-bellied stove that still radiated the memory of heat. And there, near the center of the open floor, sat a low platform made of reclaimed wood, its surface smoothed to a satiny shine. On top of it rested a carved wooden heart, simple, unpainted, beautiful in its honesty. She crossed the space slowly, her boots echoing on the new floor. When she reached the heart, she knelt and ran her fingers over the inscription burned into the grain with care. For the widow who gave a cowboy a home. Her breath caught, and she felt the tears before she tasted the salt on her lip. She sat back on her heels and turned to look at him. "It's more than I ever asked for," she said. Beau stepped toward her, his eyes unreadable but tender, his voice soft. "You gave me a place when I didn't deserve one. You looked at me and saw something I forgot was still there." She rose slowly, and he met her in the center of the barn, beneath the wide beams he had sanded with his own hands, beneath the loft that had once been broken. She reached for his hands and took them gently in hers. They were warm and rough, and they shook just slightly. "You didn't build a barn," she said. "You built the life we both thought we'd lost." He brought one hand to her face, brushing away the tears with the pad of his thumb. Then he leaned in, not rushed, not hesitant, and kissed her. It was not the kiss of longing. It was not the kiss of desperation. It was the kind of kiss that comes at the end of winter, when the first thaw cracks the river ice and the crocuses push up through the frost. It was steady and real, the joining of two people who had seen too much and still dared to believe in something beautiful. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "What now?" she whispered. He smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening in that way she had come to love. "Now we live in it," he said. "Together." Later that morning, she stood on the porch and watched him haul in a stack of cedar planks, the sun rising behind him like fire caught in glass. She turned and looked out across the field, where the grass bent under the weight of the new day. The wind carried the scent of paint and smoke and the coming rain, and for the first time in years Lila Carter felt no ache in her chest, no absence, no shadow following her through the halls of the house or curling at the edge of her bed. There was only the steady rhythm of footsteps across earth, the sound of someone coming home, the bright red doors swinging open, and the heart inside her finally beating in time with someone else's.